Mexico City, October 16, 1968. The air was still. The stadium lights burned bright against the night sky. Two men stood barefoot on the Olympic podium, heads bowed, fists raised. Their black gloves cut through the silence like thunder made visible. Tommie Smith and John Carlos, two African-American sprinters, had just finished first and third in the 200-meter final. Between them stood a white man in a green and gold tracksuit, the silver medalist. His name was Peter Norman from Australia. He didn't raise his fist. He didn't bow his head. He simply stood still, wearing a small badge on his chest that read, Olympic Project for Human Rights. It was small, almost invisible. But it was enough to change his life forever. The image became one of the most powerful photographs in human history, the Black Power salute, captured at the height of the civil rights struggle. But what most people forget is that there were three men on that podium. And the third one, the quiet one, paid the highest price. For Tommie Smith and John Carlos, the gesture was a cry for justice, against racism, segregation, and inequality in America. For Peter Norman it was something else, a moment of conscience. He wasn't black. He wasn't American. But he understood what it meant to stand beside those who refused to stay silent. He didn't raise his hand, but he stood his ground. And that, too, was rebellion. Peter Norman was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1942, the son of a butcher, raised in a working-class family where faith and fairness were the cornerstones of life. He grew up running through the streets, always the fastest kid in school, driven not by ego but by joy. By the early 1960s, he had become one of Australia's top sprinters. Fast, humble, disciplined. He wasn't a political man. He didn't march or shout. But he believed in something simple, that every person deserved a fair chance. Australia at that time had its own hidden darkness. The White Australia policy, an unspoken system that favored white immigration and marginalized Indigenous people. Racism wasn't an American export. It lived quietly in Norman's homeland too. And that quietness, that polite silence, was what bothered him most. By 1968 the world was on fire. America was bleeding from the wounds of Vietnam and racial division. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated just months before. Cities burned with protests. The civil rights movement had turned from hope to heartbreak. Even the Olympics couldn't escape it. In the United States, a group of black athletes, scholars, and activists had formed the Olympic Project for Human Rights, the OPHR. Its goal was to expose racism in sports and society, to use the Olympic stage as a platform for change. They debated boycotting the Games entirely. But in the end, many decided to compete, not to win but to protest. Tommie Smith, the world record holder, and John Carlos, the fiery sprinter from Harlem, planned something audacious. If they made the podium, they would make a statement the world couldn't ignore. On October 16 they did exactly that. Smith won gold in 19.83 seconds, a new world record. Carlos finished third, his head high. And between them stood Peter Norman, the quiet man from Australia, who had just run the race of his life in 20.06 seconds, still an Australian record today. As they walked toward the podium, Smith and Carlos told Norman their plan. They would go barefoot to represent poverty. They would wear black gloves, one each, to symbolize unity and power. They would bow their heads for those without a voice. And Norman listened. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't walk away. Instead, he said 6 words that neither of them ever forgot. I'll stand with you. They were surprised. No white athlete had ever openly supported them before. Not in that moment, not on that stage. So Carlos asked, "Do you believe in human rights?" Norman nodded. "I believe in God. I believe in equality." He asked where he could get one of those OPHR badges. When he couldn't find one, an American rower, Paul Hoffman, handed him his. Norman pinned it to his chest. It was a small gesture, but in 1968, it meant everything. As the anthem began, the world froze. 2 fists rose into the air. A white man stood between them, silent and steady. And the entire stadium fell into stunned disbelief. The image lasted less than 2 minutes. But its echo has lasted for decades. When they walked off the field, all 3 men knew something had changed, not in victory but in consequence. Smith and Carlos were expelled from the Olympic Village, suspended from the U.S. team, and received death threats back home. And Peter Norman? When he returned to Australia, he discovered that his silence had made more noise than any shout. He expected questions. He expected debate. Instead, he was erased. The Australian Olympic Committee didn't punish him officially. They didn't need to. They simply forgot him. He was never selected for another Games, even though he qualified easily for Munich 1972. He was excluded from official events, ignored by the media, and whispered about by officials who called him the troublemaker. For standing still, Peter Norman had committed the ultimate act of defiance: empathy. He went back to teaching, working regular jobs, trying to live quietly. But something inside him broke. He had stood for what was right, and lost everything that came with it. The cameras never came back. The medals didn't matter. The world had moved on. Yet the photograph remained, that one frozen moment, immortalized on posters, murals, and history books. 2 fists in the air. And between them, a man who chose decency over silence. The stadium lights had faded, but the photograph remained. And sometimes that's the cruelest thing about history: it remembers the image, not the man. For the rest of the world, Peter Norman became the other guy on the podium. The silent one. The one whose name people forgot. For Australia, he became something worse: an inconvenience. When he stepped off that podium in 1968, Peter Norman didn't know he had just crossed an invisible line. One that separated athletes from activists and silence from complicity. He hadn't raised a fist, but he had taken a side. And in a world that demanded neutrality, that was unforgivable. When he landed in Melbourne after the Games, the reception was cold. No parade. No interviews. No congratulations. His name was absent from newspapers that had once celebrated his speed. Australia wanted a hero, not a conscience. It was a country still wrapped in its own quiet segregation. The White Australia policy still existed in law, though rarely spoken of aloud. Indigenous Australians had only been granted the right to vote a few years earlier. The idea of an Australian athlete openly supporting Black Americans, and by extension racial equality, was political poison. Norman's federation called him unreliable. Sponsors distanced themselves. When he qualified for Munich 1972 with times well within the top international standard, he wasn't selected. The official excuse was team balance. But everyone knew the truth. He had stood beside the wrong men at the wrong time. Peter Norman didn't complain publicly. He wasn't built for outrage. He went back to teaching, coaching, trying to live quietly. But quietness has a weight of its own. He once said, "I didn't think I was making a statement. I thought I was standing up for humanity." But humanity, it seemed, had no place in sport. His name vanished from Australian Olympic circles. He wasn't invited to ceremonies or reunions. Even when anniversaries of the 1968 Games came around, his story was edited out, like a shadow removed from a photograph. He became a ghost in his own country. The years rolled by. The 1970s became the 1980s. The civil rights era faded into memory. Smith and Carlos became legends, invited to speak at universities, honored for their courage, their gesture transformed from outrage to icon. And Norman watched from afar, proud of them, but invisible. He lived modestly, worked odd jobs, coached young athletes in his spare time. He had a family, children who adored him, but the quiet ate away at him. The silence of erasure is its own kind of punishment. In the late 1980s, he injured his Achilles tendon, a brutal blow for a man who had once defined himself through movement. Running was no longer possible. He turned to teaching, to community work, to faith. But depression began to creep in, slow and suffocating. The medals he had once earned gathered dust in a drawer. The world had moved on to faster times, newer champions. But no record ever erased his. That 20.06 seconds in Mexico City remained, the fastest 200 meters ever run by an Australian. A record that stood untouched for decades. Yet no one spoke of it. By the 1990s, Australia was changing. The country began to confront parts of its past, the treatment of indigenous peoples, the myths of national innocence. But Peter Norman was still nowhere in that conversation. He had become a man history forgot to honor. And yet, to the two men he had shared that podium with, he was unforgettable. Tommie Smith and John Carlos never forgot Peter Norman. They spoke about him often, not as a symbol but as a friend. Peter wasn't a bystander, Smith said. He was a partner in the gesture. Carlos added, without Peter there is no moment. He made it human. They knew what he had risked. They knew he had paid the same price they had, maybe worse. Because in America, their defiance was eventually recognized as courage. In Australia, Norman's solidarity was treated as betrayal. Years later, when journalists began revisiting the story of 1968, they were shocked to discover that the man in the middle had been abandoned by his own nation. Articles appeared. Documentaries resurfaced. Suddenly, the forgotten face between the two raised fists had a story again. When asked how he felt about being ostracized, Norman smiled faintly. I knew what I was doing, he said. And I would do it again. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't rage. He just kept living. But life had its own way of breaking him slowly. The depression deepened. His health began to fail. He turned to painkillers and later alcohol. He withdrew from the world that had already withdrawn from him. There were years when no one knocked on his door. No interviews. No honors. Just silence. And through that silence he carried the memory of that day, the anthem, the crowd, the moment when three men stood for something bigger than themselves. By the early 2000s, time had finally caught up with conscience. The photo from 1968 began circulating again, this time not as scandal but as legend. Younger generations saw it not as rebellion but as truth. And slowly the world began to ask, who was the man in the middle? When the 2000 Olympics came to Sydney, the Games returned to Peter Norman's homeland. It was a chance, the perfect chance, to bring him back, to celebrate him, to finally say, we see you. But Australia didn't. Peter Norman was not invited. He watched the Games from home on television. The man who still held the national sprint record, the man who had stood for justice on the world's greatest stage, wasn't welcome at his own nation's Olympics. When journalists discovered this, they were stunned. They asked the Australian Olympic Committee why. The answer was bureaucratic and hollow. He was not part of the official delegation. But there was another delegation that didn't forget. Tommie Smith and John Carlos were in Sydney, guests of honor. When they learned that Norman hadn't been invited, they were furious. So they did what true brothers do, they found him. They called him, met him, hugged him, and brought him into the spotlight themselves. To the media, to the crowds, to history they said, this man, Peter Norman, is our brother. The three of them stood together again more than 30 years later. Older, slower, but united. The same way they had been that night in Mexico City. For the first time in decades, Peter smiled the way he used to, the smile of a man who had been seen again. He didn't need a medal. He just needed to be remembered. And though his body was failing, his spirit shone with quiet pride. He had carried the burden of decency for a lifetime. And now, finally, the world was catching up. By the time the new millennium arrived, Peter Norman had lived most of his life in the quiet shadows of a single moment. That photograph, that split second of moral clarity, had defined him more than any race, any medal, any record ever could. It had made him a hero to some, a problem to others, and a ghost to many. But ghosts have a way of haunting those who pretend they never existed. After Sydney 2000, something began to shift. Younger generations, those born long after 1968, rediscovered the image. They saw three men on a podium, united not by race or flag but by conscience. And for the first time they saw Peter Norman not as the white man in the middle, but as part of the same story. Students began to ask about him in classrooms. Journalists began to write about him in long, reflective pieces. And slowly, Australia began to confront the question it had avoided for more than 30 years. Why had they punished a man for doing what was right? Peter didn't chase redemption. He never did. He didn't demand apologies or recognition. He simply kept living, quietly, stubbornly, with a grace that seemed almost impossible after everything. He worked as a teacher and a sports administrator. He volunteered for community programs. He spent time with his family. His body was slower now, his hair grayer, but his voice carried that same gentle conviction. He didn't talk about the Olympics often. When people asked, he would smile and say, "It was never about me. It was about what's right." But those close to him knew the silence still hurt. He'd been denied the thing every athlete longs for, to be remembered with pride by the place they called home. In 2005, when Australia celebrated 100 years of participation in the Olympic Games, tributes poured in for legends across generations. But Peter Norman's name wasn't mentioned once. Not a single invitation. Not even a footnote. He watched the ceremony on television from his home in Melbourne. It should have broken him. But instead he laughed. "I guess they're still mad," he said, half smiling, half sighing. That laugh, that small, defiant laugh, was the sound of a man who had made peace with being right too soon. By then his health was declining. Years of stress, painkillers, and depression had taken their toll. He had trouble walking. His heart was weak. But his mind, his conscience, was unshakable. One evening, when a young journalist asked if he regretted wearing the badge that night in 1968, Peter's eyes softened. "No," he said. "Because if I hadn't, I'd still be running from myself." He paused. Then added quietly, "I'd rather finish last for the right reason than first for the wrong one." In 2006, Peter Norman passed away. He was 64 years old. The news barely made headlines in Australia. But halfway across the world, two men stopped what they were doing, boarded planes, and flew to Melbourne. Tommie Smith and John Carlos, his brothers on that podium, came to say goodbye. The funeral was simple, quiet, heartfelt. Friends, family, and a handful of journalists filled the small chapel. And when the moment came to carry the coffin, it wasn't Olympic officials or politicians who stepped forward. It was Tommie Smith and John Carlos. They carried Peter Norman's coffin with the same strength, dignity, and love that he had shown them that night in Mexico City. As they walked slowly down the aisle, the silence was heavy. The sound of their steps echoed like history itself, steady, deliberate, unbroken. John Carlos later said, "Peter stood with us when the world turned its back. And now we stand with him." For many who attended that day, it felt like something sacred. A closing circle of truth that had waited almost 40 years to complete itself. The image that had defined their youth had finally found its ending, not on a podium but in a small Australian church, where three men were finally equals again. Smith, Carlos, and Norman, bound by conscience, not competition. When news of the funeral spread, something stirred in Australia. People who had never heard his story began to read. Those who had forgotten began to remember. It was as if a nation realized too late that it had turned its back on its own moral compass. Peter Norman's name began to appear again, in newspapers, documentaries, classrooms. Students painted murals of the 1968 podium, this time with his name written clearly underneath. Teachers told his story as part of lessons on integrity and courage. The same photograph that once condemned him had become his redemption. In 2012, 6 years after his death, the Australian Parliament did something unprecedented. They passed an official motion of apology to Peter Norman and his family. The statement read, "This House recognizes the extraordinary athletic achievements of Peter Norman and his brave stance for human rights at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. We apologize for the treatment he received, and we acknowledge the injustice done to him." The motion was passed unanimously. It took 44 years. But the truth, however late, had finally spoken. When the news reached Tommie Smith and John Carlos, they smiled through tears. John Carlos said, "Peter was a white man from Australia. But on that day he was more black than most of us. Because he understood the fight." Tommie Smith said, "The medal I won that night was gold. But the one Peter wore was more precious. It was made of principle." And so, the story of Peter Norman came full circle, from silence to song, from shadow to light. His record still stands. His legacy, once erased, now lives in classrooms, museums, documentaries, and hearts. But more than anything, his story reminds us of something the world forgets too easily, that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stands still. That night in 1968, three men shared a podium. Two raised their fists. One stood quietly beside them. And together they changed what a medal could mean. History has a strange rhythm. Sometimes it races. Sometimes it crawls. And sometimes it stands perfectly still, waiting for the world to catch up. For nearly 40 years, Peter Norman's story had been frozen, like a photograph trapped in a frame. And then, suddenly, it began to breathe again. After the 2012 apology, Australia finally started to talk about him. Not as a forgotten athlete, but as something far rarer, a man who did the right thing when no one was watching and paid the price for it. Newspapers called him Australia's quiet hero. Filmmakers began producing documentaries about him. A generation that had grown up worshipping medals began to understand something deeper. That sometimes the measure of greatness isn't what you win, it's what you're willing to lose. Universities invited students to analyze the Mexico City photograph. Not for its composition, but for its meaning. 3 men, 3 gestures, 1 truth. It wasn't a protest of anger. It was a portrait of dignity. It wasn't about race alone. It was about humanity, and the courage it takes to risk everything for it. The image became one of the most recognized photographs of the 20th century. It appeared in museums, history books, murals, album covers, documentaries. It transcended sport. It became art, and Peter Norman at last was part of it. In the years after the apology, Peter's family often spoke of how proud he would have been, not of the apology itself but of the conversation it started. His daughter said, he never wanted fame. He just wanted people to understand why he did what he did. And people did. Around the world, the story began to travel, from classrooms in the United States to equality workshops in Europe, from sports ethics courses to Olympic retrospectives. His name became shorthand for quiet courage. Meanwhile, Tommie Smith and John Carlos continued to honor their brother. Every interview, every speech, every anniversary, they made sure to speak his name. When journalists asked them what that day in 1968 meant to them, they always said the same thing. It meant standing for something together. And when asked what Peter Norman meant to them, they said, he's the proof that conscience has no color. It was a message the world desperately needed. Because even as the decades passed, the issues that had defined that moment, racism, inequality, silence, never truly disappeared. They evolved. They adapted. Different faces, same injustice. Different times, same courage required. And every time a new generation protested, spoke up, or knelt down for what was right, someone would bring up that photograph. Someone would say, do you remember those 3 men in Mexico City? And that's when Peter Norman's legacy lived again. In 2018, on the 50th anniversary of the Mexico City Games, tributes poured in from around the world. In Australia, schools held assemblies. In the US, museums dedicated entire exhibits to the moment. And on social media, that new digital podium, thousands shared the image captioned simply, he stood for what was right. It went viral. A half-century later, a man who had once been erased by silence became a symbol in a world of noise. The Australian Sports Museum unveiled a life-sized bronze statue of Peter Norman in Melbourne. Not in mid-run, not holding a medal, but standing exactly as he had on that podium, silent, steadfast, wearing the O-Pitcher badge. When the statue was revealed, Tommie Smith and John Carlos stood beside it, older now, their faces lined with time and memory. They smiled through tears. Carlos whispered, "Brother, we told you they'd remember." And they did. The crowd cheered, the cameras flashed, and somewhere, in the space between applause and reflection, it felt like something had been healed. Not just for Peter, but for everyone who had ever stood on the right side of history at the wrong time. The world had finally caught up with his conscience. But there's something else about Peter Norman's story, something even more timeless. It's not just about redemption. It's about what it means to be human in a system that rewards obedience more than integrity. Peter wasn't famous. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't even supposed to matter that night in 1968. He was just an athlete. One man, one race, one moment. And yet, by making one quiet choice, he became immortal. We live in a world obsessed with noise, with victory laps, with hashtags, with declarations. But Peter Norman's power was silence. His protest was stillness. He didn't demand attention. He didn't need to. He simply stood where he was needed. That's why his story endures. Because every generation needs to be reminded that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply refuses to look away. 50 years later, the message of that podium still echoes, through stadiums, through classrooms, through the hearts of anyone who's ever wondered what they'd do when the moment came. Would they speak? Would they stand? Would they risk being forgotten just to do what's right? Peter Norman answered those questions before the world even asked them. And for that, long after the medals tarnish and the records fade, his name will remain. Time has a way of softening edges, of turning conflict into story and pain into history. But some stories don't fade. Some stories stay alive because they speak to something that never stops mattering. Peter Norman's story is one of those. It's not about speed or medals or even protest. It's about presence. About the courage to be there, to stand when it would be easier to walk away. In the years since his death, the world has replayed that image countless times. On screens, on murals, in classrooms, in hearts. And each time it means something new. For some it's about race. For others it's about solidarity. But for everyone it's about conscience. Because that's what Peter Norman represented. The conscience of the games, the conscience of sport, the conscience of humanity when the world preferred comfort over courage. If you look closely at the photograph, you'll notice something subtle. Peter isn't looking down like Smith and Carlos. He's looking forward, straight ahead, calm and steady, as if staring directly into history itself. That's not defiance. That's conviction. It's the gaze of a man who understood that silence can be powerful, if you choose what it stands for. And that's what makes the image eternal. Because in that stillness there is no anger, no politics, no noise. There is just truth, raw, quiet, undeniable truth. In 2018, during a university lecture on ethics in sport, a student asked a professor, "Would you have done what Peter Norman did?" The professor paused for a long moment, then said, "I'd like to think so. But the truth is, you never know who you are until the moment arrives." That's the power of Peter Norman's story. It's a mirror, not for nations but for people. It asks us to look inward and ask, what would I do if the whole world was watching, and I had to choose between silence and justice? And maybe that's why, half a century later, that single photograph still commands silence whenever it appears. It doesn't need sound. It doesn't need movement. It just needs the weight of recognition, the realization that courage often lives in the smallest gestures. Because real courage isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't even need victory. It just needs conviction. The quiet kind that survives when everything else falls away. Peter Norman never asked to be remembered. But he was. Not by the committees, not by the politicians, but by the people, by anyone who's ever stood beside someone suffering and chosen empathy over comfort. He reminds us that solidarity isn't about shouting with the crowd. It's about standing with the lonely. It's about saying without words, "I see you, and I won't look away." The Olympic Games were created to celebrate human greatness, the speed, the strength, the skill. But Peter Norman's greatness wasn't in his legs. It was in his heart. He proved that true victory doesn't happen when you cross a finish line. It happens when you refuse to cross your principles. That's why, long after the gold has faded and the stadiums have crumbled, his story still shines. Because he showed the world that the greatest race of all is the one we run within ourselves. When Tommie Smith and John Carlos look at that photo now, they don't see three athletes. They see three brothers. Three men bound not by medals but by moral courage. And when people look at that same image decades later, they see something even more profound. Proof that humanity still exists, even in the loneliest moments. If you walk through Melbourne today, you can find his statue. He stands there quietly, not running, not posing, not smiling. Just standing like he did that night in 1968. The city moves around him, cars, lights, noise. But he remains still, looking forward. As if reminding everyone who passes that doing what's right doesn't always make you a hero. Sometimes it just makes you human. And that's enough. Because in the end, Peter Norman didn't refuse his gold medal. He redefined what it meant. He turned it from a prize into a principle. From a decoration into a declaration. from something you wear around your neck into something you carry in your soul. And maybe that's what the world needed all along. Not another champion, but a reminder that integrity still matters. So the next time you see that photograph, those two fists raised and that one man standing quietly between them, remember this. He wasn't forgotten. He was waiting. Waiting for the world to become ready to understand what he already knew. That courage isn't black or white. It's simply right. In the end, the world remembers the winners. But sometimes, the truest victories belong to those who simply stood their ground. Peter Norman never raised a fist. He didn't shout. He just stood, still, silent, unbreakable. And in that stillness he told the world everything it needed to hear. His courage wasn't about power, it was about presence. The courage to do what's right even when no one's watching. And to live with the silence that follows. Because sometimes, the loudest act of rebellion is simply refusing to look away. If this story moved you, if you believe that courage still matters, don't let it fade here. Subscribe, share, and stay with us. Every day we bring you the hidden stories behind the flame, the triumphs, the tragedies, the forgotten souls who made history real. 2 new stories, every single day. The truth behind the gold, and the people who carried its weight. Until tomorrow, when another story begins to burn.